Hello, Evan Dammarell here, and I got some news about the future of Locked On Cavs, and it will not have me as part of it. After the sudden changes to the show, um, the network has decided that it's the best course of action for Locked On Cavs to have a total reset and refresh with new hosts and new personalities, and yeah, it's the end of an era, I guess, if you want to call it that. Either way, it's been a lot of fun, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you who made this journey with me for nearly 1,000 episodes. Since in December 2019, I was super hesitant to do this, and fast forward almost 5 years later, and I'm so thankful I got to have this experience since it's more than simply just basketball to me. It made covering the Cavs fun. The friends, colleagues, coaches, and players, and thanks to Cavs PR for making the coaches and players part possible, that I got the chance to speak with on the show, and in turn, getting to share all of it with you made it even more enjoyable. And hopefully, I've left you guys with some good memories too. I'm not quite sure yet for the next steps for me podcasting wise, but if you like what I do, support the work myself and others do at Right Down Euclid. As some of you can probably tell, Right Down Euclid's namesake is an homage to former Cavaliers play-by-play announcer Fred McLeod's iconic call whenever a player drives to the basket. And since Cleveland's heart beats to sports, we're here to cover it all right down Euclid, win or lose, bringing you real, local, in-depth, independent, on-the-ground coverage that will always and forever be free and accessible and never behind a paywall. But since we are a nonprofit and we're not in this to make money, we do rely on support from audience members like you. So, again, if you grow to miss my voice on this show or anywhere else, support Right Down Euclid today. The link for that will be down in the show notes, description, however you're consuming this podcast, it'll be there. And thank you again to everyone who was part of this journey. And since this is the end for me, I wanted to kind of go full circle and have things end where it began. And on today's show, I will be joined by the Chase Down's Justin Rowan, the guy I first recorded with when I was officially announced as one of the hosts of Locked On Cavs back in December of 2019 to discuss the state of the Cleveland Cavaliers and what's to look ahead for with this team. And yeah, thanks again, everyone. And until then, until we cross paths or you hear me on another podcast, stay gold.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to Locked On Cavs. How you doing? I'm Evan Dammarell, and on my technical right, but I guess physically speaking left, if you're looking at how the camera's laid out, is Justin Rowan. But come on in and sit on down, because I gotta first let you know that this episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. The easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports is Prize Picks. Just go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code all lowercase LockedOnNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for your first deposit match up to $100. But as I had mentioned at the top, before we get into the nitty gritty of it, it is the last time we spoke injured member of the Chase Down podcast. Justin, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. It's we've taken a couple weeks off since the last game from the Cavs. We're going to be back next week. It's probably the longest I've gone without sitting in front of a mic in a little while. So thank you for getting me back in the seat, back behind the mic, and in front of this camera.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I guess that could be a warm up for you as you dive into.
Oh, I stay ready. There's no need for warm up. Even after a little time off, I stay ready. Don't you worry about that.
Actually, no, but you teed me up perfectly. Speaking of staying ready, Justin, Cavs president of basketball operations, Kobe Altman, more or less said that dramatic wholesale changes weren't going to come to the Cavs this offseason. I think a lot of people are projecting that to being moving on from Darius Garland, Jared Allen, building around Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley. But you are quite the data keeper when it comes to what these lineups do and don't do together. And I'm just going to pass the mic to you. Do you agree with Altman's sentiments that just like not blowing up what they had built only 2 years into this technical project is the right way to go about things?
I that's hard to say because I think one of my kind of central frustrations when it comes to Cavs discourse is people will say that the data supports something without actually providing said data, and that just always drives me nuts. I'm seeing sentiments that the guard pairing doesn't work when you look at last year, you look at this past season, you look across the board. The data says that they are better together as a team. They are better together than as a part. But I do think, anytime you get to this kind of stage of team building, you have to evaluate all options. And just because something has worked doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a version that can work better. And I would
Mhm.
expect the Cavs to explore those options. I would be very surprised if their approach to this offseason was, hey, let's make changes for the sake of changes. Like, let's prioritize, an archetype or a theoretical way of playing versus talent. I think if there's opportunities to change the style of play to, kind of jumpstart the offense beyond what it has been through trades while maintaining that talent level, I see them go that route. But when I see big trades and stuff like that, where let's trade stars for role players because this kind of fits a style that we see with some other teams, I'd be very surprised if that was the approach.
Yeah, I think I'll be frank, like that's the right way to approach it in general, just because it's just how this Cavs team under Kobe Altman, as just whether it's general manager or president of basketball operations, they've always been patient and pragmatic. Like they spent a solid week deciding JB and evaluating JB Bickerstaff's future of the team before making that decision despite, reports coming out before the body was even cold that the Cavs were cooked and they have to like do X, Y, and Z to do that. So I do agree that like, yeah, let's figure out what does work, what doesn't work. I do think it's interesting though that like Altman's sentiments were it took the Milwaukee Bucks almost a decade to hit the point they were with like that core foundation of Chris Middleton and Giannis Antetokounmpo. Or
Mhm.
in the Denver Nuggets case, it's Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic, and I think there are parallels there. I think remaining patient is good, and I also just think not reacting for the sake of reacting or making a trade for the sake of making a trade may not result in anything that you really need just because like you said it is easy to put this team under a microscope or maybe just look at a small sample size and say like oh yes X Y and Z role players will improve this team laterally maybe a little bit above laterally but I keep coming back to this idea of like oh if you want to entertain trading any of these guys the return that the Cavs get versus what they're getting currently with said player just doesn't seem worth the squeeze.
Yeah, and I think when you look at core players, that is part of your core as it currently stands. When you look at the Denver Nuggets, there was probably a time where Gary Harris was considered part of their core, right?
Correct.
The Milwaukee Bucks, that was probably the case for Eric Bledsoe. When you identify a player as a core piece, you're only really moving it for a piece that you believe is going to be part of your core, whether that's Aaron Gordon, whether that's a Drew Holiday trade. The summer prior to the Donovan Mitchell trade, we had Chris Fedor on the podcast who said, Lowry's probably the closest thing to a core member of this team outside of, the core three, like even closer than Colin Sexton. And he was moved, but that was for an obvious core piece in Donovan Mitchell. So, I would expect that if there is a trade, it would be something kind of that magnitude of, all right, we're bringing in someone that we believe is going to replace that member as part of the core rather than just role players. Because if you're talking about, Mitchell and a big as, kind of your core and the rest is just going to be well fitting role pieces, that's the Utah Jazz. That's what they had. They had, kind of 3-and-D playmaking wings all over the place, a lot of spacing, and they had limited team success. Donovan, didn't have the best years of his career until he was in Cleveland. So I think you have to learn lessons from that experience, from what has worked these last 2 years, and thoroughly evaluate every option. But, you know, it's the same thing with the coaching staff. It's the same thing when you look at potential trades. We've entered kind of a funky part of team building where it's the hardest step to achieve. And the
Hmm.
reality is, even in stuff that makes sense on paper and works on paper, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be an improvement. We don't know that the coaching change is going to be an improvement. We don't know if there is, a core trade that it's going to make them better as a team. This is a very, very difficult stage, and I expect the Cavs to, approach it understanding that and really thoroughly considering every single option.
No, I absolutely agree, and I think that's where you and I are on the same page. And also, just I think how the Cavs orient and operate as an organization is they are patient, they are pragmatic. I think they are opportunistic when the opportunity arises. Whether that's, I mean, think about how they sat on the sidelines quite a bit to get Jared Allen, or they were opportunistic in the fact that like the Knicks walked away from the table, but they threw an offer at the Jazz that the Jazz just couldn't step away from, even though the Knicks were kind of sowing their oats and fielding their options when it comes to Mitchell. But it's such a delicate balancing act because I with time removed and also just not maybe paying attention to the discourse as much, just to give myself a mental cleanse, just of like fans, whether they're in the comments on YouTube or my mentions on Twitter or whatever you want to call it, just saying like, oh, they need to do X, Y, and Z. They need to blow this up yesterday. I'm like thinking, let's just trust the process a little bit too, because they are a very talented team. They have a very talented, in a very rare situation, talented core unit of Garland, Mitchell, Mobley, and Allen, where there are ways to accentuate and continue to build around that. And I think
Mhm.
just like for this offseason, like, yeah, you did a good job last year getting role players and key role players in Max Strus and George Niang. I think those are just like clear fits in terms of shooting. I wouldn't say this team is flawless by any stretch. I don't think any team is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but the Cavs now can just kind of approach this of, okay, how do we continue to accentuate this core foundation and build upon the supporting cast we've more or less assembled over the last year or so?
Yeah, I mean, if you're just going by kind of knee-jerk fan reaction after a season, last year was Jared Allen, right? Like he was the target, and oh, let's move Jared Allen for Christian Wood because he's a big that shoots threes, and Josh Green, right? Like let's do that kind of stuff. And in hindsight, like that kind of emotional trade would be a mistake, right? So if there is, a piece that fits better or fits in a way that trends with the direction they want to go, prioritizing offense, I can see that. I can see them exploring those kinds of options. But when it comes to just selling off star players for role players because hey, we went 9-3 in a stretch where we didn't really play any winning teams with just Mitchell and Allen, that I don't think that's necessarily wise, right? Like you look at every player on the Cavs that played a significant role in that stretch, every single one of them had their body breakdown. Mitchell had, knee soreness. Wade had knee soreness. Max, Karras, Jared was probably kind of the lone healthy one, but everyone that was playing a significant role over that stretch, their bodies didn't necessarily hold up from that. Like you see some of the year-end comments where minutes were a concern for Donovan Mitchell. Well, he's like not even top 15 in minutes. He's playing, fewer per game than a 40-year-old LeBron James. If we're going to need to manage his minutes, increasing the load and giving him a new role probably isn't super high on my list. Like I don't want to increase his responsibilities. I want to make life easier for him so he can be
Mhm.
at his most effective when it matters most. So that's the kind of stuff you have to weigh. And as much as people want to simplify everything and act like they're simple decisions, there really isn't.
No, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Like there is not a simple decision or a simple way to react and navigate this. And I think that is kind of the beauty, maybe some of the frustration and the chaos that just comes with in the NBA offseason, because there are always going to be teams that are looking to be opportunistic. Like if Donovan Mitchell's, despite the reporting, doesn't re up with the Cavs, there'll be plenty of suitors that are blowing up Cleveland's phone to say like, "Hey, we'll trade Donovan." But the Cavs could also just say, "You know what? Let's keep playing this out and see what happens." And I think it's the instant gratification of a trade or things like that. But when looking at this team, let's dive in more to the subjects of just like what can they do, whether it's the draft, free agency, like just specific targets or just, kind of archetypes in mind. We don't have to name names or anything like that just because it's so early into the process still. But first off, got to give a quick word from today's first and only sponsor, Prize Picks. As I had mentioned before, today's episode of Locked On Cavs is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 3 million members. It is the easiest and most exciting way to get into the action while watching your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more players' stats and watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks has something for every sports fan, from basketball to hockey to League of Legends and everything in between. When everyone is playing, you can pick between LeBron, Caitlin Clark, Connor McDavid, and any league player. I can't keep up with LCS anymore. All in the same entry. Just to play Prize Picks, just download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match of $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, I am back with just the Chase Down's Justin Rowan to talk more just about the state of the Cleveland Cavaliers, and we're both in agreement that maybe just making a trade for the sake of a trade isn't what the Cavs need to approach, especially because this is a young team that still needs to kind of find its legs and grow. I think the Kobe Altman's comments about Evan Mobley maybe not hitting his expected potential is more on his part in terms of just team building and things like that. But I think that's just an interesting way to look at things because like they do have a nice collection of players, but there are flaws. And in your eyes, Justin, like in terms of just like archetypes, like again, we don't have to name names or anything, but like a guy that like would just make sense in terms of a mold for the Cavs, at least for me, is like a guy who can play that 3-4 spot and allow the Cavs to continue to maybe explore going small, all while maybe playing bigger and just having a guy that is a plug and play support option for them, whether it's off the bench or as a starter.
Yeah, I mean, last offseason, I was a big advocate when there were reports that, hey, they're going after PJ Washington, they're going after Nas Reed. Those are the type of guys that I think, like, theoretically, that's the archetype you want to have next to Evan Mobley, where those guys, a player that can play the four offensively while rotate over to provide rim protection on the defensive end of the floor. Because I don't want Evan Mobley to be pigeonholed into a defensive role where, all right, you got to be the rim protector. You're standing there. We need you underneath the basket. If you're not there, we just have wings kind of around, and teams can kind of pick us apart. I don't want him to be Rudy Gobert. You see, the most impactful defensive players are able to roam, able to play free safety, and I think that's why in the past Dean Wade has worked so well next to Mobley, because he is someone that can provide rim protection. He is someone that has that kind of defensive versatility. It's a tough archetype to find, but whether you are, referring to, all right, that's going to be if they make a trade and they move on from the two big pairing, if that's kind of the primary player that you're getting back, you want someone, in my mind, that can fill that archetype. Or if you're trading for a wing, you're bringing in someone that can do that at a lower level, but can still kind of provide a little bit of that. You talked about it a little bit earlier, just kind of evaluating the talent, and no team build is perfect. In the NBA, you have to build a team with the best talent that is available to you. We all understand what ideal archetypes would be for the core of this team, and how you can kind of supplement it, but there is no archetype store you can go to. There is no, all right, default replacement value 3-and-D wing that gives you playmaking, default stretch 4. Like, you have to name names, and teams aren't going to give up those valuable players. So when it comes to kind of a pairing next to Evan Mobley, that's kind of what I have in mind, whether that's as a third big that you can kind of trial some stretchy things, or if you do end up, going that direction and changing the makeup of the core, you'd want someone that can fill that archetype.
And the tricky part is like filling that archetype, like you said, like that is I don't want to say prototypical modern big man, but like that's the ideal outcome you want from a 4 spot, is a guy who can play 4 or 5, or if, God willing, you have to put him at the 3, you can do that if you want to go super big. But like he's able to provide you defense, rebounding, 3-point shooting, but also just like be a backup 5 and also just provide that spacing next to Evan Mobley. And I think like if you look at the draft, like I am going to name a name like Kyle Filipowski from Duke isn't like a perfect solution of it, but he's a guy who could soak up minutes and he provides you spacing and things like that and can let you get a little creative in lineups and stuff. But like in the same vein, you understand why the Cavs went after George Niang as hard as they did, because he is a four by size and he's a shooting four by size. But like, yeah, there are the defensive limitations, but you're hoping you can maybe mitigate that a little bit with either an individual pairing of Mobley or Allen. But like, let's just look through the lens of Mobley. Like, yeah, it makes sense, but you can always improve on it. And like, that's why I was a fan of the Marcus Morris Sr. signing on paper, and then you saw what Morris Sr. could kind of give you because he still has some gas in the tank. You're thinking like, okay, yeah, that's a little bit more of what they need is a guy who can play the four predominantly, but can switch to the three. And like if the Cavs, like they did super small lineups during the playoffs with Morris Sr. at the five, just because injuries are unfortunate and really took a toll on this Cleveland team all season, especially at the most inopportune time. But it's guys like you said, like guys like that aren't really growing on trees. Like you can't just go to the store, or if you're Kobe Altman, you can't just call a team saying I want X player for as little as possible, because no, any team would realistically hang up the phone if you did that. And
Mhm.
so I think that requires you to get a little creative. And I do wonder, like, could coaching, maybe a coaching change or just a new voice or perspective or just set of eyes, could kind of plug and play and look at these options a little bit more. But like I think there is a foundation there. It's just now, how far do you want to run with it before you realize, okay, we maybe need to explore other options, whether it is just maybe finding a guy who's comfortable being a pseudo 4-5 instead of a 3-4, or a guy that is comfortable handling backup point guard minutes in the event like Darius Garland gets banged up again, or Donovan Mitchell has injury problems again. And because to your point in the first segment, like I don't think the solution is playing these guys even heavier minutes all season long and just kind of hoping that rides you out. And especially in the postseason, like you want them as healthy as possible. And I think that's the goal, is to find supporting pieces that can just lighten their load a little bit. And that's the tricky part of it, because guys that like the Cavs clearly need aren't easy commodity. They're a premium commodity, and that's where the like the team building process of it all just kind of gets a little trickier.
Yeah, and when you look at the data over the last 2 years, the thing is, the two big lineup does work offensively
Hmm.
if both Darius and Donovan are playing at a high level. If one of them is out of the lineup, it does not work offensively. If one of them isn't playing at as high of a level as they typically are accustomed to playing at, it does not work offensively. And I think what you saw this year, both Darius and Donovan started off with the hamstring injuries. Darius had the hand injury. The early returns of Donovan just playing at point guard were awful earlier this season. And then
Yeah.
Darius starts to find a bit of a rhythm and breaks his jaw, and Mobley's out at that time. So then, we know that the one guard, one big lineups, those are going to work, right? Like in theory, you're playing 16 to 18 minutes with all four of them together. And then the majority of the game is that staggered one guard, one big, right? You're getting that 30 minutes a night. We know that that works, but the two big lineup, just because of the rigidity of this roster, you need both of those two pieces playing at such a high level. And I think that's something that they have to evaluate of, okay, can we make it so that we have built-in redundancies in this roster where we have a little bit more playmaking depth, or we have the shooting to make this work and to survive some injuries or tough
Mhm.
stretches from those players. So that's going to be a tough evaluation process, but it'll be really interesting to see how they approach that.
No, I absolutely agree. And let's kind of like maybe hit the nail on the head a little bit, and we'll talk about it more in the final segment of this show. But like, is it a, maybe it's a coaching thing, or maybe it is just like working within the margins of the draft or free agency? Because the Cavs do have options. They aren't like in luxury tax
Yeah.
absolutely deadlock yet, but there's options out there, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the next segment. So we are back for the final segment of Locked On Cavs, and we'll just jump right back in. Justin, when it comes to just like a coaching perspective, like you said, like in an ideal world, when this team is fully healthy, 16 to 18 minutes is when you see Mitchell, Garland, Mobley, Allen sharing the floor together. You can plug and play Struce, Okoro, just assuming of last year's
Yeah.
roster, like whomever there at that spot, and kind of do some weird, funky stuff. But do you think that should be kind of just the focus for the Cavs? Like, okay, you're obviously going to have, when looking at head coaching candidates, I should add,
Hmm.
you're going to have these minutes, all four of these guys on the floor together. But how can you creatively build a rotation and lineups and everything else? Just because there are going to be moments where it's going to be one big one guard. It could be a moment where it's big with a backup guard instead, or it could be a minute with a guard with a backup big. Like, how can you be creative in the fact that like we do have four very high end talents and some very nice supporting pieces surrounding them, but do you think it's a coaching thing, or do you think it's just the Cavs are still a little flawed and they maybe need to add maybe a piece or two, or is it just a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of all. I always hesitate to put everything on the coach. It's always the easiest because
Fair.
that's the easiest part to turn around. But sometimes, it's buy-in, right? Like I think in the past, JB was getting very consistent buy-in with this roster, and voices do have expiry dates. I don't know if that's what occurred, but the frustrating thing about some of the struggles down the stretch, or even the playoff games that didn't go their way, we were sitting there on the podcast being like, what they need to do is stuff that we have seen them do both in the regular season and in the playoffs. The
Mm-hmm.
consistency of that execution is no longer there. And I think from a coaching standpoint, when you're interviewing candidates, you want to see creativity. How are we going to keep both of the guards involved when they're on the court? How are we going to make sure that both of them are getting enough touches and kind of allocating those possessions? Are we able to get more movement and have a less rigid offense? Because I thought the Cavs, when they ran their stuff, ran very good stuff. It's just so often, they'd be standing around or it's a three-man action and the other two guys aren't really being involved. And I think when you look at Boston and some of these high-level teams and kind of use the playoffs as a data point, what you see with those teams is a lot of guys that created a lot of positions, a lot of movements, making things easier, getting those easy possessions. And there
Mm-hmm.
just wasn't that consistently. So I think that kind of mentality and that strategic approach to the offense would be something that I prioritize because looking at the playoffs, there were just too many times where I was saying, okay, like one of my big complaints prior to Donovan getting hurt was, hey, Darius isn't on ball. Like Darius's touches have been dramatically slashed. He is playing a shooting guard role and he's not getting on ball reps at all.
Mm-hmm.
And like the offense just doesn't function as well. Mitchell's playmaking against the top teams isn't at that level. Like
Yeah.
guys were shooting 60% off of Mitchell's passes in the playoffs. So it's not like he was setting guys up and they were bricking everything. If they shot 100% on his passes for the playoffs, he would average under 8 assists per game. That is not a high enough level playmaking when you're talking about a lead guard and a playmaking guard. I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence. Everyone looks at, okay, Jared Allen goes down and all of a sudden the offense takes off, even though the offense didn't take off. And Mobley's
Yeah.
last 3 games against Orlando were a struggle. I don't think it's a coincidence that even though Darius played well in one game and played poorly offensively or shot poorly offensively in the next, I don't think it was a coincidence that Mobley's best games offensively and two of their best 3 offensive games in the playoffs period came with Donovan out of the lineup and Darius running the offense. That's not to say, like, I'm not going to go a bad faith route and say, oh, Donovan's the problem. Just like I'm
Okay.
not going to look at that stretch with Darius and Mobley out and say that they were the problem. This should work on paper. And I think, finding ways to consistently get maximum value out of both of those guards and the offense overall would be what I'd be prioritizing when, you're looking at these head coach candidates.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect way to put it is how do you maximize the opportunities as often as possible? Because let's be realistic, like the Cavs are gonna have off nights. They're gonna be nights where like maybe Garland or Mitchell, assuming this whole group is still together. Of course, we don't know what's gonna happen in the next by this time next year or anything. But like assuming this whole core group is still together heading into next season, like you gotta find the ways to maximize these opportunities. And sure, you can try your best to account for maybe a guy having an off night or an injury happening, but like it's sports. There's no perfect way to find that solution, but I think the creativity point is absolutely correct, and I think again, like it's hard to, or more so unfair, to crystallize just this team's success without Mobley and Garland in mid-December to the hot streak they had in early January and so on, and then just kind of how the injuries just took their toll for them come playoff time against a fairly ugly series against the Magic. It was a defensive grinder, but I think not having Allen and also obviously not having 100% Donovan Mitchell against Boston certainly was a deciding factor for Cleveland because they played hard. They went down swinging in every single
They would
game.
have
They
had a
lost.
chance, man. They would have had a damn chance. Boston has not looked impressive.
They've had a bit of an easier walk, I think, than Luka and the Mavs have had so far. Even
That's
after,
fair to say. Yeah.
yeah, like they've had a bit of an easier walk just in terms of injuries and things like that. But that's neither here nor there. It's just like looking at this team, like they are on the precipice. Like I think, just wrapping up with like what Kobe Altman said, Altman shared just like in his individual conversations with most of the players, if not all of the players, like they all feel that they're right on the precipice of becoming a title team. And I do wonder, like, and there's just so much noise in the data or just like evaluating this team. Like, injuries certainly did play a part during the regular season, but it's also just like unfair and hard to crystallize it all because it would have been a dramatically different outcome if they were healthy at certain points in the season, especially just
Yeah.
when the season mattered most come playoff time.
Yeah, but the unfortunate thing about NBA and team building is fair has nothing to do with it, man. Like you got to make tough decisions with the data you have available. I think there's enough encouraging data when you look over the last 2 years to draw some conclusions. But like I said before, just because I think people have kind of misunderstood this when I've said it in the past. Like I'm usually, kind of sitting there, kind of correcting some narratives and pointing out the facts of what people say, but just because it's worked doesn't mean there isn't an avenue to make it work better.
Yeah.
I think when I look at, the most important parts of the core, to me, it's the two guards and it's Mobley. Like as much as Jared Allen's taken a step forward, I think that that's the most important part because I do not believe that Donovan Mitchell can play point guard. I do not think that that is something that works at the highest level. I think that lowers your ceiling. I think, when you get to play the best teams in the league, that's just such a big burden on him. And I don't want to have that. So getting it to work, getting it to a point where, hey, let's get back to where we were 2 years ago in your first year together, where it was less your turn, my turn, where, Darius, in my opinion, had the best season of his career. The scoring points per game were identical. The assist to turnover, only Nikola Jokic among high usage players had a better assist to turnover ratio. Defensive metrics were up across the board. Like the only drop off was assists, and that's because there was more playmaking happening from everybody else. But I thought that was his best year of his career, and I think getting an offensive plan that comforts concerns of, hey, we're not going to stick you in the corner like you were in the playoffs. Like we're going to make sure that you're involved. We're going to make sure that Donovan's getting his playmaking touches. You're both going to get chances to run the offense, and kind of smoothing any issues or concerns or trepidation that you have about game plan. That would obviously be a priority. But the nice thing with those guards is the question is making it work on the offensive end. People, I think, default to, 163, 161. It's not going to work defensively. In the regular season, they have had an elite defense with both of them on the court. In the playoffs, they have had an elite defense with them on the court. With just one big, whether that's Mobley or Allen, they have had an elite defense with both guards and just one big on the court. Like, I think that is really, really, really important data because offensively, I think both can play on and off ball. And I think it's good for both of their careers. And maximizing their talents, that they maximize their ability to play both on and off ball. Because I think, whether it's Darius, being a primary initiator or whatnot, if he's going to, win as part of a championship level team, he's going to need to play with a high usage player. And as a result of that, he's going to need to know how to play off ball. For Donovan's standpoint, you need to have a playmaker to handle those responsibilities and keep him in the role that he's best at. So it's going to be really, really interesting. But I think, to me, if you're talking about what aspects of the core to prioritize, that's really what I'm looking at.
I think you're 100% spot on just in that evaluation. I think this is a bit of a good palate cleanser just for, I think, everyone, for us to have this conversation, just because I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, let's just, or like you said, I'm just scrolling through it now. People like blow this up. Also, I just saw Donald Trump got a clean sweep on the verdict. So 34-0, good for him, I guess. But either way, in a more basketball sense of things, yeah, they're in an interesting spot. I think people are really underselling how talented this team is because the returns are just not worth what the Cavs are probably looking for, unless trades happen anywhere. Like they could be a lot more dynamic and a lot more just like. But you said at the very, 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 very top, like when you had your conversation with Chris Fedor, like if it's a guy you view as a core player, if you're going to trade them, you have to find a player that is going to equal that talent, but also improve upon that talent that you already have. And I think that's just people are rushing to conclusions because either they're bored and they want to see the Cavs do something exciting, but we'll see what the next steps are. But man, I thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And as we head out of here, you had mentioned you guys are coming back on Tuesday. Tell us more about that. Maybe a little teaser if Carter's going to let you.
Well, I'm the one that does the show planning here, so I'm the brains behind the operation. I'm pretty sure we're coming back Tuesday. 99% sure. We've got to look at the schedule again. But just I think what we'll be looking at is kind of an overview of the last two seasons, right? Look at Kobe Altman's press conference. We got to talk about the JB firing because that's happened since then. But really, kind of looking at the data of what we've learned from the last 2 years, what we've learned from this playoff run, what's actionable, and you know, like I said earlier, man, like you got to make tough decisions based on limited and incomplete data, but you do still have some stuff to look at, right? You still have, the data points that are available to you, and that's what the team's going to have to work at. So I'm interested in kind of diving in, been doing some research over this break, just kind of looking at the pairings and whatnot. And I'm excited to start talking Cavs again, man. You mentioned a draft name. It went right over my head. I haven't done any draft prep yet, so we'll need to have an expert on for that. But we will have that coverage eventually as well. Just not next week. We'll push that back a little bit more. I'm going to procrastinate.
No, I totally get it. If you told me I was a draft expert in any stretch of the imagination, I'd say no. Like, I think
You told
Tony
me I
Pestis
was
said
an
it
expert
good.
at anything. I'd say no. I'm just someone that talks a lot.
That's a fair way to put it, but I think like Tony Pestis said it best the other day. If you put any draft prospect that could be in range at 20 in front of me, I'd say like, yeah, I can see a fit, and then that's what I'd say because I don't really understand the full depth of anything. But yeah, Justin, thank you for your time. Everyone, go check out the Chase Down when they're back and all their Cavs coverage. And until next time, I'm Evan Dammarell. That is the Chase Down's Justin Rowan, and this has been Locked On Cavs.